In our last lecture, we discussed how the progressive movement arose out of the traditions of the populace in rural America, as well as calls for reform from voices that wanted to challenge the status quo during the Gilded Age. This led to efforts to clean up urban blight while maintaining America's culture of capitalism and democratic participation. In this unit, we will be discussing political and economic reforms. It's important to note that regardless of where we've placed these specific examples that we're going to go through, there is a overlap between the different reform areas. For example, women participating in politics could be considered a political reform, while much of their efforts were focused on social reform, for example, improving working conditions in factories for women and children. We've already seen how the political machines of people like Boss Tweed, along with the influence of big money by corporations such as Standard Oil, influenced politics during the Gilded Age. Our first look at political reform, we need to turn to the state of Wisconsin. While political reform would come from both Democrats and Republicans, perhaps one of the most important voices concerning political reform came from the state of Wisconsin through the voice of Republican Governor Robert Fighting Bob La Follette, who crusaded against crooked railroads and lumber companies to return the power of the government to the people. La Follette is considered one of the first Republican insurgents to reach the Senate, and he stood against the Republican Old Guard, who favored laissez-faire capitalism with government help. In 1903, La Follette pressured the legislature of Wisconsin to institute an election that was open to all voters within a party. This became known as the direct primary. In our world today, we can see how the Democrats are currently engaged in primary elections to decide who the candidate should be to face President Trump in the 2020 elections. Previous to this, party nominees were chosen by political bosses. Another effort for reform aimed at allowing all citizens to introduce a bill to circumvent the influence of party bosses and their control over the legislation that states would address. The term for this kind of voter-driven legislation is called. Furthermore, La Follette helped institute the referendum, a process where voters can cast ballots for or against proposed laws that were initiated by the legislative branch. And to ensure that voters could remove corrupt party officials, Wisconsin instituted the recall, a voter-driven initiative that would create a special election to remove a political official from office. Progressive states took measures to eliminate the influence of party bosses over the masses with the institution of the Australian ballot, or the secret ballot. No longer could they reinforce people to vote through bribes. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of political reform of the early 20th century is the adoption of the 17th Amendment. If you recall, the original Constitution put the power to choose U.S. senators in the hands of state governments. This often left the decision up to corrupt political bosses and political machines. When the 17th Amendment was adopted in 1913, Americans now could elect U.S. senators directly. The most progressive-minded states, like Washington, California, and Oregon, even extended the right to vote to women. The progressive era was a crossroads for women in America. Throughout the 19th century, a woman's role was viewed as a separate sphere 3, 2, 1. The Progressive Era was a crossroads for women in America. Throughout the 19th century, women were viewed Three, two, one. Throughout the 19th century, a woman's role was confined to the home. In this regard, women were said to have different spheres of influence and importance than men. However, in the Progressive Era, women became political not as a rejection of their traditional roles, but as an extension. For example, social reform movements were seen as maternal issues, addressing issues such as child labor, unsafe food in the home, and protecting the moral and ethical behavior of society were uniquely the grounds for the gentler, kinder sex. Agitating through groups like the National Consumers League and the Women's Trade Union League, women advocated for social and moral reform. In this regard, women became an indispensable part of the Progressive Army. Magazines and the settlement house movement offered middle-class women a glimpse into a world they felt they could change. It exposed middle-class women to problems plaguing the city: poverty, political corruption, and intolerable working conditions for children and lower-class women. This is a great picture demonstrating the bridge between the sphere of women as the kinder, gentler sex responsible for moral and social development and modern feminism. Here, Jane Addams and her fellow pacifists protest on behalf of the Women's Peace Party, America's involvement in World War I. You can see by their attire that these women have not entirely shed the traditional notion of what a woman's place and image should look like. In the same respect, they are protesting the political direction of America aiming towards more involvement in World War I. The justification here was that women were defending the lives and future of America's youth that could have been enlisted in the fight overseas. Although the party initially attracted 25,000 members, America's entry into the war 2 years later eroded popular support because pacifist internationalism became viewed as anti-American. It's important to note that the advocacy of women aimed at improving the welfare of those that were viewed as weaker members of society. This would include women and children themselves. Florence Kelley, for example, became one of the most famous advocates to improve factory conditions as Illinois' first chief factory inspector. She took control of the National Consumers League and advocated for boycotts of businesses that didn't take care of its women and children workers. The argument that women and children needed special protection is best exemplified in the Supreme Court case of Muller v. Oregon, 1908. Attorney Louis Brandeis, who would later become a Supreme Court Chief Justice, persuaded the Supreme Court to accept laws protecting women workers by presenting evidence of harmful effects on the factory's labor force of women, who he argued had weaker bodies. While progressives hailed Brandeis's achievements as a triumph over existing legal doctrines, we can see how this argument that women are physically weaker than men became problematic for later liberal generations. If laws regulating factories were not enforced, they proved to be worthless. For example, in 1911, at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company factory in New York, 146 women were killed when a lethal fire broke out after someone threw a cigarette in a scrap bin. While there were in place fire codes that would have prevented the factory from locking its doors during operation hours, many of these women were trapped on the 9th and 10th floor due to ignorance of these laws. In addition, a lack of fire escapes and proper fire equipment led these women to die in an inferno or jump from the windows in a desperate attempt to save their own lives. Most of the victims of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire were poor immigrants. Their bodies, disfigured beyond recognition, were put on display so that family members could arrive in hopes of identifying them. This became a public spectacle. The press printed photos, and it galvanized a generation of reform to fight for better workplace safety rules. By 1917, 30 states had worker compensation laws. By the turn of the 20th century, cities like New York had one saloon for every 200 citizens. Out of this growing issue of domestic violence and alcoholism was born the Women's Christian Temperance Union. This is a flyer that advocated for temperance. As you can see here, it tallies the cumulative cost of alcohol consumption to a drinking man's family. It illustrates the influential role of women in the temperance movement. Alcohol abuse threatened the stability and economic well-being of the family and was still considered the woman's sphere at the turn of the century. Another famous political cartoon of the Progressive era demonstrates how a man's participation in alcohol consumption leads to the downfall and ruin of the family, and ultimately suicide and death. While we will get into the Prohibition movement more in depth later on, it's important to note that it was a cornerstone of the frustration and activity of progressives, especially women. By World War I, nearly half of the US population lived in a territory that had identified itself as dry. Some states did this in order to restrict the consumption of alcohol. Others did it as a way to address nativist sentiments towards European immigrants who congregated in such places, especially those from Germany and other Eastern European nations. The final area of reform that we need to speak about concerning the Progressive era is that of economic reform. Stories from authors such as Henry Demarest Lloyd and Thorstein Veblen attacked the excesses of wealth and the exploitation of the masses for the profit of the few in literature that was popular of the day. Chief amongst progressive reformers in economics was none other than Teddy Roosevelt, the first modern president. He's considered the first modern president in the United States because he was the first to use government as a vehicle to directly help the public interest and to use the media as a way to establish his position and fight for change. From his bully pulpit, Roosevelt supported progressive reforms with strong rhetoric, but in reality was much more moderate than his public image had established. Often bypassing Congress, like Jackson had done a generation before him, Roosevelt was enormously popular amongst a large percentage of Americans for his direct action. While we've already established President Roosevelt as the first president in American history to play a significant role in world affairs, Roosevelt's policy of speak softly and carry a big stick could also apply to his domestic policies as well. Roosevelt, though he was born from affluence, was quickly established as a progressive politician, fearing that the public interest would be submerged by special interests, both in the workplace and on Capitol Hill. When he became president after William McKinley's assassination, Roosevelt proposed a progressive policy he called a square deal for capital labor and the public at large. His three main principles of his policy included the three C's: control of corporations, consumer protections, and conservation of natural resources. The new president's progressive roots were quickly challenged in 1902 with labor disputes at the anthracite coal mine in Pennsylvania. 140,000 workers of the United Mine Workers Union in coal mines in Pennsylvania went on strike, demanding a 20% increase in pay and a reduction of the workday from 10 hours a day to 9. Fair weighing of coal and better safety conditions rounded out their demands. President of the mine, George F. Bayer, assumed that the public would react against the miners, especially as winter neared. Bayer contacted the Roosevelt Administration and demanded that they were prosecuted for a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, as President Cleveland had done in the Pullman strike back in 1894. Roosevelt invited both sides of the dispute to the White House. When it became clear to the president that Bayer, and not the union itself, was unwilling to cooperate, Roosevelt threatened to seize the mines and operate them with federal troops if the owner refused to compromise. Roosevelt rationalized that the public at large was in jeopardy of having no coal during the wintertime, so he threatened it was his duty to intervene. This action was unprecedented in American history. Owners of the mine eventually consented to arbitration, and the miners settled for a 10% pay boost and a 9-hour work week. The owners also got assurances that the union would not be officially recognized in future labor negotiations. Also, they were allowed to increase the price of coal by 10%. The larger impact of the anthracite coal strike of 1902 was the creation of the Department of Commerce and Labor, which was originated to settle disputes between capitalists and labor forces in 1903. This was such a big job that 10 years later, the agency was split into two departments, the Department of Commerce and the Department of Labor. Within the Department of Commerce was the development of the Bureau of Corporations. This became the executive arm of the department, authorized to probe businesses in interstate commerce. This was highly useful in helping break stranglehold of monopoly and paving the way for an era of trust busting. The word trust had become a fighting word in the progressive era. Roosevelt's policy believed that trusts were here to stay. Some were good trusts that had positive public consequences. Others were bad trusts that lustily greeded for power and took advantage of the public for personal gain of the owners. The Roosevelt's administration to break the first trust burst into the headlines with a legal attack on James Hill and J.P. Morgan's Northern Railroad Securities Company in 1902. While Hill and Morgan would challenge Roosevelt's efforts to label their holdings as a monopoly, in 1904, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the antitrust suit and ordered the Northern Securities Company to be dissolved. This enhanced Roosevelt's reputation as a trust smasher. As Roosevelt tangled with the railroad monopolies of the Northern Securities Trust, he helped Congress pass through two important anti-monopoly bills targeting the railroads. The Elkins Act of 1903 aimed primarily at reducing the abuses of rebates sold by railroads. Heavy fines could now be imposed on both railroads and the shippers for abusing the rebate policy. Even more influential was the Hepburn Act of 1906. It expanded the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was created in 1887, severely restricting the railroad from giving free passes, which was nothing more than a bribe. Could nullify the existence of rates and stipulate maximum rates if the railroad companies tried to extend them outlandishly. Really, the Elkins and the Hepburn Act, along with enforcement by Roosevelt, gave teeth to the previous anti-monopoly legislation, such as the Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Antitrust Acts that we've talked about in the past. Throughout his administration, Roosevelt was inundated with 40 lawsuits and proceedings against giant monopolies. Most of these were upheld by the Supreme Court. In 1905, the courts declared the Beef Trust to be illegal. It also later took down the sugar, fertilizer, harvester tractor, and other key products as well. While Roosevelt became known as the Trust Buster, his real purpose was symbolic and not practical. His efforts were to prove conclusively that the government and not private business ruled this country. Roosevelt keenly distinguished between good trusts and bad trusts. He believed in regulating, not fragmenting big business combines. He hoped to make business leaders more amiable to federal regulation. He never swung his trust-crushing stick with maximum force. Instead, industrial behemoths would be more tamed by the end of Roosevelt's reign. And in fact, his successor, William Howard Taft, actually busted more trusts than Roosevelt himself. This would actually lead to a conflict between Roosevelt's hand-picked successor. Taft launched a suit against U.S. Steel in 1911 when Roosevelt had encouraged it to absorb a coal and iron facility in Kentucky a few years previous. This is one of the most famous antitrust cartoons depicting Roosevelt. It's called Roosevelt Tames the Trust. Legend to the contrary, Roosevelt did not attack all trusts indiscriminately. Rather, he pursued a few high-profile cases against a handful of corporate giants in order to tame other businesses into accepting government regulation. Another element of economic reform undertaken by the Roosevelt administration was that of consumer protection. European markets had begun threatening to ban American meat since some of the meat from small packing houses was found to be tainted with botulism. In 1906, socialist author Upton Sinclair published his famous expose about meatpacking companies in Chicago called The Jungle. He had been appalled by the working conditions and meant for this to be a call towards greater amounts of socialism and workers' protections. But the public was appalled with his description of the unsanitary food and products being produced in these factories. You'll be able to read some of these details in your primary sources, but really it detailed the filth, disease, and putrefaction in Chicago's damp and ill-ventilated slaughterhouses. Everything went into the burger: fingers, sawdust, and even a rat or two. Even Roosevelt read Sinclair's book and was moved to appoint a special investigation commission whose report found the details of Sinclair's novel to be accurate. In 1906, Roosevelt introduced to Congress the Meat Inspection Act that would require meat-producing facilities that shipped beef over state lines to be inspected by the federal government from the farm through the factory and to the store front window. While at first meat production companies would resist this new legislation, they eventually adopted it. To carry that label was to carry the prestige of being a certified high-quality product. The Meat Inspection Act was also followed by the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Medications, most of them sold over the counter, were heavily adulterated with alcohol and addictive barbiturates. The labeling oftentimes provided false promises and were almost more dangerous than the ills that they claimed to cure. The Pure Food and Drug Act was designed to prevent this adulteration and mislabeling of food and pharmaceuticals. This is a photo of the meatpacking plants following the passage of the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. White-jacketed inspectors are examining the hogs in a Swift and Company packing house in Chicago. Agents like these made some progress in cleaning up America's septic slaughterhouses after the passage of the law in 1906. Meat that was processed and shipped over state lines needed to carry a seal that it had been FDA approved. Arguably the most significant and longest lasting economic and cultural reforms Roosevelt left was that of the dawn of the conservationist movement. Roosevelt had grown up a sickly child and oftentimes was denied opportunity to go outdoors and do things that normal boys his age did. As he got older, he trained himself through boxing, vigorous workouts, and outdoor hikes to become healthier and stronger. As a young man, he became a soldier and thrived in the rugged life of the military, especially during the Spanish-American War. So he eagerly picked up the banner of the conservationist movement. Keep in mind, at the tail end of the 19th century, the West had been declared closed. Americans feared that land and America's natural resources were not endless and were in fact running out. Through the leadership of Teddy Roosevelt, Congress responded to these concerns with a landmark act known as the Newlands Act of 1902. Washington authorized to collect money for the sale of public lands in western states. This money would be used to fund the development of irrigation projects. Many of the western river systems were dammed up. For example, the Roosevelt Dam on the Arizona's Salt River was dedicated by Roosevelt himself in 1911. There is hardly a river west of the Rockies that today isn't dammed or channeled one way or another to provide for drinking water and irrigation for the region surrounding it. This is Roosevelt and famed naturalist John Muir visiting Glacial Point on the rim of Yosemite Valley in California. In the distance is Yosemite Falls. A few feet behind Roosevelt is a sheer drop of 3,254 feet. Muir would influence Roosevelt in his love and appreciation for the outdoors. But the person that probably deserves the greatest amount of recognition for the Roosevelt conservation policy is this man here, Gifford Pinchot, the father of the modern Forest Service. He's posing here with his family and fellow nature lovers. His wife, Cornelia, was a driven feminist, political activist, and a passionate gardener, and a proponent in her own right of people's rational use of the natural world. This is Lake Powell, named after the famed explorer John Wesley Powell and formed by one of the several dams on the Colorado River. Lake Powell has been the focus of intense controversy. It drowned the spectacularly beautiful Glen Canyon, but created recreational facilities for countless Americans, as well as an important water reserve for the West. Roosevelt worked to preserve the nation's shrinking resources, especially the forests. He set aside some 125 million acres in federal reserves and earmarked millions of acres of coal deposits and water resources useful for irrigation and power. Conservation and reclamation were Roosevelt's most enduring and tangible legacies. This is a photo of loggers in the state of Washington around the turn of the 20th century. It took the sweat and skill of many men to conquer the giant fir like this one. Once the tree was felled, a team of oxen driven by a bullwhacker would drag the log out of the woods along a skid road. Skid Road, sometimes corrupted as Skid Row, was also a name for the often sleazy sections of logging towns, where loggers spent their time in the off-season. Both Roosevelt and Pinchot were conservationists. They argued for the rational use of the country's natural resources and promoted the multi-use of public land. Grazing, forestry, and recreation all could be accomplished in one national park. They oftentimes faced conflict from preservationists, groups like the Audubon Society and the Sierra Club that wanted to preserve pristine wilderness and the western landscape. Roosevelt and Pinchot argued that wilderness was waste, and the conservationists won out over the preservationists. This is best demonstrated by the outcome of the San Francisco-built dam in the Hetchy Hetchy Valley. This issue caused deep division between preservationists and conservationists. Often considered the Grand Canyon of the Sierra Nevadas, the Hetchy Hetchy Valley was a pristine landscape. John Muir battled for 7 years unsuccessfully to prevent the building of a dam that would turn this spectacular glacial valley into a reservoir, which would provide San Francisco with fresh drinking water. Today, environmentalists are campaigning to restore the Hetchy Hetchy Valley to remove the dam. Yet the influence of the dam in power and fresh water remains the same. Another consequence of Roosevelt's conservationist movement was the creation of something that is uniquely American, the road trip. These sightseers are at the Grand Canyon in 1911, probably and unwittingly foreshadowing the mass of tourism that arrived with the dawning of the automobile. Soon, millions of motorized Americans would regularly flee from the cities and suburbs to get away from it all in wilderness sites, increasingly overrun by their fellow refugees from civilization. Roosevelt was a wildly popular president, in fact, one of the most popular presidents of the 20th century. But after being reelected in 1904, he declared that under no circumstances would he be a candidate for a third term. He unwittingly created a lame duck presidency following this statement. In 1907, as his second term was coming to a close, America suffered a sharp setback when a short panic descended on Wall Street. Capitalists took the opportunity to criticize Roosevelt. Although once again the depression was brought on by overspeculation and a lack of regulation of American banks, capitalists blamed Roosevelt and his progressive policies for triggering the recession. In fact, they dubbed the recession of 1907 the Roosevelt Panic. On his exit, bitter from the attack on his character and policies, Roosevelt paved the way for long overdue monetary reforms. Roosevelt would move the nation again towards a more diverse currency, increasing the amount of silver and other precious metals that our currency was based upon. Congress responded with the Aldrich-Verland Act, which authorized national banks to issue emergency currency so that the country would not go into a stagnation during times of recession. And the Roosevelt administration paved a smooth path for President Wilson to pass the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which would allow the Federal Reserve to control both interest rates and inflation, as well as the country's monetary supply. In the next unit, we'll take a look at the progressive politics of Roosevelt's predecessors, William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. While Roosevelt would leave big shoes, this string of important presidents were essential in the progressive politics of the early 20th century.